When you look at the news and it feels like everything, from global supply chains and long-standing alliances down to just basic border security is suddenly incredibly fragile? Well, today we are unpacking a really fascinating and honestly highly critical op-ed published by the Khmer Post in May of 2026 that attempts to answer exactly why that is. The piece is titled "The Architect of Ruin: How the First Doctrine Weaponizes Ego and Destroys the World." In it, the author takes a really hard analytical look at the current global geopolitical shift toward national ego. So we're going to impartially break down the author's core arguments, map out the specific case studies they use, and explore the deep structural claims made about modern statecraft. Because at the end of the day, this stuff directly impacts our interconnected lives.
To establish the central premise right out of the gate, I want to share this highly evocative quote from the text. The author writes, "When ego becomes the primary driver of statecraft, the result is not strength, but a systematic dismantling of the peace and stability required for a functioning world." This single sentence perfectly encapsulates the core thesis we'll be exploring today, the argument that prioritizing national ego actually creates severe, lasting global instability.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll start by defining the first doctrine. Look at America First in action. Explore Thai nationalism and ASEAN. Examine the Cambodian experience. Explain the silo effect. And finally, discuss a new path forward.
All right, Section 1. Defining the first doctrine.
To kick things off, the op-ed begins by defining the psychological and political roots of these modern nationalist movements. The text defines the first doctrine as an ideology operating on the fallacy that a nation can actually thrive in isolation, or by actively undermining its neighbors. The author makes a really interesting point here. They note that while this doctrine is very often marketed to the public as a triumphant return to sovereignty and domestic prosperity, it's fundamentally a lethal narrative. Under this doctrine, international law isn't seen as a shared safeguard, but just as an inconvenience to be bypassed.
Building on that, the op-ed attributes a specific psychological term to this mindset, calling it collective narcissism. The author argues that this is the absolute underlying psychology of the entire doctrine. Think about it. It creates this highly toxic, zero-sum environment. This specific mindset is exactly what turns long-standing international partners into adversaries. In this framework, if a neighbor gains something, it's instantly perceived as a personal loss, literally transforming shared borders into battlefields.
Moving on to Section 2, America First in action. So the author grounds these theories in a macro-level case study, the actions of a global superpower. Now, what's really interesting about this analysis is how the op-ed contrasts the stated goals of the 2025 Trump administration against its alleged global outcomes. The stated goal, of course, is domestic prosperity and sovereignty, right? However, the author views this approach as a thinly veiled form of interventionism. They argue it serves only narrow, short-term interests, entirely at the expense of established global norms and multilateral cooperation.
To back this up, the text lays out a pretty concrete timeline. Early 2025 marks the return of the Trump administration, which the author argues brought a massive renewed emphasis on transactional diplomacy. Then, fast forward to late 2025, and skirmishes suddenly erupt on the Thai-Cambodian border. Later that same year, the U.S. steps in to broker a ceasefire. This direct sequence of events, according to the article, leads us straight to the highly fragmented global landscape the author is writing from in May 2026.
Let's look a little closer at that U.S.-brokered ceasefire. The op-ed offers a really sharp critique of the intervention, framing it within what they call a peace-for-trade model. The author contrasts a genuine peace commitment, one that actively aims to resolve underlying historical or territorial causes, against the U.S. model. The text claims this model was linked strictly to bilateral tariff negotiations. The author argues this creates a dangerously fragile transactional deal. It only lasts exactly as long as the immediate economic benefits remain, leaving the actual, real-world conflict to just fester beneath the surface.
Which brings us to Section 3, Thai nationalism and ASEAN.
Now, let's see how this exact same doctrine manifests on a regional level. Here, the article analyzes the Thai People First agenda under Prime Minister Anutin Charnvirakul. And much like the superpower case study, we see a stark contrast. The official stated goal focuses on internal economic restructuring and strict border security. But the author's analysis claims that this rhetoric is actually weaponizing historical grievances. The argument here is that national ego is being used specifically to distract from domestic political polarization and deep internal fissures.
And the real-world consequences detailed in the op-ed are severe. The text points directly to the 2025 armed clashes along the Cambodian border, which were characterized by devastating airstrikes and drone attacks. The author asserts that these clashes were absolutely fueled by nationalist rhetoric.
When first becomes your primary rallying cry, the text argues, diplomacy is suddenly viewed as a weakness. Military superiority ends up being used to forcefully settle disputes that international bodies have already completely adjudicated.
Section 4. The Cambodian Experience.
And this brilliantly illustrates the collateral damage of these policies, the human cost behind the geopolitical theory. For a nation like Cambodia, the author notes, this isn't just political posturing. It is an existential threat to people simply trying to rebuild their lives. We're talking about a nation that has spent decades rebuilding its social fabric and working with international NGOs to secure basic land rights. But the op-ed argues that when powerful neighbors adopt a first doctrine, vulnerable communities suffer immensely. Hard-won progress is reversed, and critical humanitarian assistance is callously reduced to just another bargaining chip.
Moving to Section 5. The silo effect explained.
Zooming back out a bit, the author introduces the overarching structural flaw that dooms this philosophy to failure, regardless of which country adopts it. They call this the silo effect. It's defined as a fragmented approach to governance that inherently slows down necessary global solutions. The author makes the case that in our modern world, supply chains, ecosystems, and digital networks are inextricably linked. Therefore, a siloed approach absolutely guarantees obsolescence. Ironically, by trying to build an isolated fortress, a nation actually makes itself brittle, prone to sudden, violent collapses rather than bending to adapt to modern challenges.
The human cost of this silo effect is highly tangible. By prioritizing political ego, the op-ed states that leaders are effectively declaring war on the future. Think about where the money goes. Crucial resources are actively diverted away from education, healthcare, and climate adaptation, and directed instead toward airstrikes and border barriers. The text powerfully warns that the destruction of the world doesn't require a dramatic nuclear winter. It happens through the steady, quiet accumulation of these selfish acts.
Finally, Section 6. A New Path Forward. Fortunately, the op-ed doesn't just offer a critique and leave us hanging. It outlines a proposed solution to these compounding crises. The author's call to action centers on a concept called collective resilience. The text argues that the first doctrine is a dangerous relic of the past. Surviving modern environmental and economic challenges requires a fundamental shift. Collective resilience is defined as a required model of cooperation that is completely incompatible with nationalistic ego. It demands building robust networks, championing community rights over the whims of states, and prioritizing the shared reality of our planet.
So, the crucial point is captured beautifully in the author's concluding thoughts. They write, "True leadership is not about putting one's own people first at the expense of others. It is about recognizing that first is an impossible position in a circle." That really sums up the article's core takeaway. In an interconnected world, the destruction we visit upon our neighbors will inevitably find its way back to our own doorstep.
Which leaves us with this final thought to ponder based on today's analysis. Is true leadership putting your own people first? Or is it recognizing that first is an impossible position in an interconnected world? It is a deeply complex question with profound implications for how nations interact today, how our economies function, and what kind of future we're building together. I hope this breakdown helped clarify the core arguments presented in this op-ed. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking those big questions.